Hi everyone, my name is Genesis and I am a member of SCDAI. SCDAI is a student center for diversity, advocacy, and inclusion. We are an organization maintained by students for students that aims at fostering a more inclusive and diverse environment in higher education for students and staff. So let's dive into today's topic, which is intersectionality. So at SCDAI, we talk a lot about intersectionality. So we thought it was about time that we finally dive into what intersectionality actually means. So what is intersectionality? Intersectionality is a term that was coined by African-American professor Kimberle Crenshaw in 1989. Kimberle Crenshaw describes intersectionality as it is basically a lens, a prism, for seeing the ways in which various forms of inequality often operate together and exacerbate each other. Kimberle Crenshaw first introduced intersectionality in the context of feminism, aiming to highlight how women's experiences are influenced by the intersection of our different social identities. So intersectionality is a way in which our multiple social identities sometimes converge to create barriers that are often overlooked or not understood at first glance. So what is the link between intersectionality and inclusion? Inclusion, as we know by now, is actively removing barriers that don't allow individuals or groups to fully participate in society. So inclusion defines the quality of our actions once we've identified these barriers. So we don't do anything to remove these barriers. Our actions are exclusive. We are actively adding on to these barriers or enabling, supporting these barriers. Our actions are discriminatory. When we actively remove these barriers, that's when our actions are inclusive. Intersectionality, on the other hand, is a step before that. Intersectionality happens while we're identifying these barriers. With intersectionality, we understand all the intersections, all the links, all the way that they overlap between a group or individual's social identities in order to identify their barriers. So let's put it into perspective with an example. Let's take the intersection of a Black man. Now, because of racism, the Black ethnicity of this man can represent a negative prejudice and bias. For instance, less educated or less civilized than members of other races. While on the other hand, this person's gender can represent positive prejudices and biases because of misogyny. So for instance, he's stronger, he's more capable, more courageous than a woman or other genders. Now, in the intersection of this person's social identities, namely being a man and being Black, these prejudices intersect to create an additional layer of privileges and barriers. In this case, the prejudice towards Black people intersecting with the prejudice towards men create the prejudice that this man is dangerous, violent, or a thug. A barrier not shared with non-Black men, non-Black women, and Black women. Intersectionality doesn't replace the privileges and barriers attached to our social identities. It simply adds on. So this person's privilege for being a man isn't replaced by their racial ethnicity. The intersectionality simply compounds to highlight an additional barrier. So this added layer that we now understand because of intersectionality doesn't replace the privilege of, for instance, that he is still less likely to be a victim of domestic violence than a woman would be. And it also doesn't remove the existing barriers of being perceived as less educated or less civilized by society for being Black. It just adds a different context to it. So now that we understand what intersectionality is, why do we need intersectionality? Many believe that intersectionality is simply a way to further complicate the laws of inclusion and the way that we remove barriers. And yes, that is true. It is naive, impractical, and unrealistic of us to assume the centuries of oppression and exclusion that are still enabled and enforced by systems, institutions, and privileged individuals can be removed through quick and easy action. In order to holistically tackle the barriers that don't allow certain groups of people and individuals to fully participate in society, we need to understand the complexity of intersectionality. We need to understand that oppression as well as privilege are layered. Unless we are willing to include intersectionality in our social justice and social equity practices, we won't be able to sustainably remove barriers that block so many groups of people from actively and fully participating in society. In a TED Talk that will be linked in the description below, Kimberle Crenshaw talked about the woman that inspired her to come up with the term intersectionality. It's about a woman that sues a company for not hiring her for being a Black woman. Now, the judge in this case dismissed her lawsuit because the company did employ women and did employ Black people. So they didn't see any basis for her claims. However, the women that were employed were white women that were employed in secretarial and assistant, etc. positions, while the Black people that were employed were Black men that were employed in, I guess, more physical labor type of positions. So what the judge failed to understand is the intersectionality. She wasn't being discriminated for being a woman. She wasn't being discriminated for being Black. She was being discriminated for being both. The company in this case, the employer in this case, didn't see any value in adding a person who is both Black and a woman to their staff. And it is when we refuse to acknowledge, understand, and accept these intersectionalities and the added layers of barriers that they represent for people that we miss out on being able to remove these barriers. And privilege works in that same way. If we refuse to acknowledge intersectionality, we also refuse to acknowledge the privileges that we receive because of certain intersections. While I am a Black woman, I am a light-skinned Black woman. And if I refuse to accept that intersectionality, I refuse to accept the privileges, the layer of privilege that adds onto me in comparison to darker-skinned Black women. And if I refuse to acknowledge this layer of privilege, I can't take part in countering the oppression of darker-skinned Black women that enable said privilege for me. So as an individual or as an institution, we invite you right now to reflect on your social identities and the ways that they intersect. In the same way for the people around you, in what ways do these intersections create additional layers of barriers and privileges for the people around you? All right, so that was all the time that we have for today. Thank you for tuning in. Don't forget to like, comment, subscribe, share, all of the above, and we'll see you next time.